It takes a special kind of courage to walk into the lion's den. But what do you do when the world outside the den is even more terrifying? This is a story about a little girl, no older than 10, barefoot in the snow, who walked into a bar full of the meanest-looking bikers you have ever seen. She was looking for a hero. What she said to their leader, a single cryptic sentence, would unleash a storm of leather and chrome, a righteous fury that would shake the city to its foundations. She told him her mommy was in a box, and in his quest to understand what that meant, he would uncover a secret so vile, a betrayal so deep, it would change not only her life, but the very soul of his entire brotherhood forever. The cold was a predator. It stalked the narrow alleyways of the city's forgotten north side, a phantom with teeth of ice and a breath that stole the warmth from your very bones. It hunted in the swirling vortexes of snow that danced under the jaundiced glow of failing streetlights. For 10-year-old Lily, it was more than just weather. It was a monster, wrapping its invisible claws around her bare ankles, sinking its fangs into the thin fabric of her faded pink coat. She stood across the street from the place, the Forge. The name was burned in angry red neon, a sign that hissed and flickered, one letter threatening to surrender to the darkness with every gust of wind. It wasn't a place for children. It wasn't a place for anyone who valued quiet or the absence of trouble. It was a long, low brick building with windows painted black, a fortress of solitude for men the world had decided it didn't want. From within, even over the howl of the winter gale, came the muffled, guttural thump of music, a bass line that felt like a second, angrier heartbeat in the frozen air. Lily shivered, but not just from the cold. Her small hand was wrapped tightly around the worn plush body of Barnaby, a teddy bear whose button eyes had seen more tears than most people see in a lifetime. He was her only soldier in this war, her confidant, the keeper of all the secrets that were too heavy for a little girl to carry alone. Her feet were numb. She'd lost her boots 2 weeks ago, along with most of their other things, when the first big lock had appeared on the door of their apartment. The man with the clipboard hadn't even looked at her. He just looked at her mother, Sarah, whose face had been a mask of pale, silent shock. They had left with 2 trash bags of clothes and Barnaby. Now the bottoms of her thin leggings were soaked through, and she had long since lost the feeling in her toes. She curled them against the salted, gritty pavement, a useless defense against the biting frost. Why was she here? Because of the box. It wasn't a real box, not one made of cardboard or wood. It was an invisible one, but it was stronger than steel. It had started small, just a shadow in the corner of her mother's eyes after the doctors had used all the big words and sent them home with a stack of papers. The shadow grew every time the phone rang, her mother's voice getting smaller and smaller as the voice on the other end got louder and angrier. Then the letters started coming, official-looking envelopes with red ink and bold warnings. Lily couldn't read all the words, but she understood the pictures in her mother's face when she read them. Fear, hopelessness, a slow, creeping surrender. Each letter was another wall on the box. Each phone call was another lock. For the last 2 days, the box had been closed shut. Her mother lay on the thin, stained mattress in their tiny room at the Starlight Motel, a place that had no stars and very little light. Her eyes were open, staring at a crack in the ceiling, but she wasn't there. She didn't speak. She didn't eat. She didn't even seem to breathe sometimes. She was just gone, trapped. Mommy was in the box, and this morning, the final nail had been hammered in, a bright orange piece of paper stuck to their motel room door. Lily had seen one before. It meant they had to leave. Tonight. The monster of the cold, which had been circling them for weeks, was finally about to pounce, and her mother couldn't even move to run. Desperation is its own kind of fire. It had burned away Lily's fear, leaving behind only a hard, desperate resolve. She remembered a story her mother used to tell her, a long-ago story about her father, the man she'd never met. He was a knight, her mother had said, but he didn't ride a white horse. He rode a machine that roared like a dragon, and his armor was made of leather. He and his friends, a brotherhood of knights, looked out for people. They were protectors. Lily had found the name of their castle in a dusty old photo album her mother kept hidden. The Forge. Written on the back of a faded picture of a smiling man with kind eyes. his arm around her beautiful, happy mother. A man wearing a jacket with a roaring wolf's head on the back. This was it. Her last hope. She had to find a knight. Clears throat. You have to understand the sheer force of will this took. Imagine it. You are small and the world is big and loud and cold. You are alone. The one person who is your entire universe has gone silent. And your only plan is to walk into the one place every instinct tells you to run from. What is that, if not the purest form of courage? Lily took a deep, shuddering breath, the icy air searing her lungs. She clutched Barnaby tighter. "Okay, Barnaby," she whispered, her voice a tiny puff of white in the gloom. "We have to be brave now. For Mommy." She waited for a break in the sparse traffic, a lone truck rumbling past, its tires hissing on the wet, snowy pavement. Then she ran. Her bare feet slapped against the freezing asphalt, each step a jolt of pain that shot up her legs. She didn't slow down. She reached the other side, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and stood before the heavy, black-painted wooden door. There was no handle she could see, just a small, grimy brass plate that said push. It looked impossibly heavy. For a moment she faltered. The rhythmic thud of the music from inside was like the growl of a great beast, warning her away. The smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke seeped from the cracks around the doorframe. It smelled like every bad decision she had ever been warned about. But then she saw her mother's face in her mind, staring, empty, lost in the box. That image was all the strength she needed. She squared her small shoulders, took 2 steps back, and ran at the door, putting her entire 90-pound body into it. The door groaned in protest, then swung inward with a sudden, surprising lack of resistance. Lily tumbled through the doorway, carried by her own momentum, and landed in a heap on a floor, sticky with things she didn't want to think about. And the world stopped. The music didn't just stop. It was like a record had been scratched into oblivion. The loud, boisterous laughter, the clinking of glasses, the gruff murmur of 100 conversations. It all vanished into a sudden, deafening vacuum of silence. Slowly, painfully, Lily pushed herself up, first to her knees, then shakily to her feet. She was standing just inside the doorway of a cavern. It was vast, dark, and filled with giants. The air was thick with smoke that swirled in the beams of light hanging low over pool tables. The walls were covered in dark wood, flags and memorabilia she couldn't make out in the gloom. But she wasn't looking at the walls. She was looking at the men, dozens of them, maybe more. They were all huge, mountains of muscle and beard and denim and leather. Tattoos spilled down forearms like inked rivers, disappearing under the sleeves of thick flannel shirts or the heavy cuts that bore the club's insignia. The same roaring wolf she'd seen in her father's photograph. Every single face, hard and weathered and dangerous, was turned towards her. 100 pairs of eyes locked onto the tiny, shivering, barefoot girl clutching a teddy bear. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken questions. Lily felt a tremor of pure, primal fear run through her. This was a mistake. A terrible, terrible mistake. These were not knights. These were the monsters the knights were supposed to fight. Her instinct screamed at her to run, to flee back into the relative safety of the blizzard. But her feet, frozen and numb, felt rooted to the floor. Her gaze darted around the room, from one intimidating face to the next, searching for something, anything, that wasn't pure menace. And then she saw him. He was sitting at the bar, on a stool that seemed impossibly small beneath him. He wasn't just big, he was immense, a true giant. His shoulders were as wide as the door she'd just come through. A great thick beard, more salt than pepper, covered the lower half of his face. His hair was pulled back in a long, graying ponytail. He wore the same leather cut as the others, but his seemed older, more worn, the patches on it telling a story of decades, not years. He hadn't turned on his stool like the others. He had simply angled his head, and his eyes, deep-set and startlingly intelligent, were fixed on her. There was no amusement in them, no anger, just a quiet, unnerving intensity. He was watching her the way a mountain watches a storm gather at its peak, patient, immovable. This was the leader, the king, She knew it in her bones. This was the man she had to talk to. Bear felt the shift in the room before he heard it. It was a subtle thing, a change in the atmospheric pressure of the place. The forge was his sanctuary, his kingdom. He knew its rhythms, its sounds, its very breathing, and in one instant it had held its breath. He'd been nursing a glass of bourbon, the amber liquid of familiar comfort in his hand, listening to two of his younger prospects argue about engine timing. It was a normal Tuesday night. Cold, quiet, the kind of night that kept the trouble away. Then the silence, total and absolute. He didn't need to turn around. In a room full of men like these, a sudden silence could mean only two things: cops or a challenge. He slowly set his glass down on the scarred wooden bar top, his muscles tensing, his senses on high alert. He glanced at the reflection in the mirror behind the bar, past the rows of bottles, and he saw her. It was like seeing a ghost, a tiny fragile thing, a splash of pale pink and blonde hair against the backdrop of black leather and gloom. She was standing just inside the door, looking like a fawn that had wandered into a wolf pack's den. Barefoot. He registered that detail with a jolt. Barefoot, in a blizzard, clutching a stuffed bear like it was a shield. The men were frozen, unsure how to react. This was an unprecedented event. Women came to the bar, yes, but not children. Not like this. Not alone. A few of the younger ones looked on the verge of laughter, a nervous, inappropriate reaction to the sheer absurdity of the situation. Bear shot a look in their direction, a glare so cold and sharp it could cut glass. The thought of laughter died instantly. He watched as the girl pushed herself to her feet. He saw the tremor in her small frame, the wide, terrified blue of her eyes as she took in the scene. He saw her fear. But then he saw something else. As her gaze swept the room and finally landed on him, the fear was eclipsed by a flicker of something steely. Determination. Every instinct he had, honed by 30 years of leading this club, of navigating a world of violence and betrayal, told him this was not a prank. This was not a mistake. This was something important. He watched silent as she began to walk. Lily put one foot in front of the other. The floor felt a million miles long. The silent, staring faces were a gauntlet she had to pass. She kept her eyes locked on the mountain of a man at the bar. He was her destination, her only hope. She ignored the tattooed arms, the grim expressions, the sheer, overwhelming size of the men she passed. She just walked. The path seemed to clear for her, the bikers shifting their legs or leaning back slightly, giving her a narrow channel to pass through without being asked. It was an unconscious, almost reverent gesture. She finally reached him. She had to crane her neck all the way back to see his face. He was even bigger up close. His hands, resting on the bar, looked like they could crush stone. A long, faded scar cut through one of his eyebrows, giving him a permanent look of fierce concentration. Lily's voice, when it came, was a tiny, fragile thing, barely a whisper in the cavernous silence. "Sir?" Bear didn't move. He just looked down at her. The top of her head barely reached the height of the bar stool he was sitting on. He could see the way the cold had chapped her lips, the blue tinge to her skin. He could see the raw desperation in her eyes, a look he knew all too well. He'd seen it on the faces of soldiers in foxholes, on men facing a lifetime behind bars. He had never ever seen it on the face of a child. "Yeah, little one?" His voice was a low rumble, like rocks grinding together deep underground. He made a conscious effort to soften it, to keep it from scaring her away. Lily swallowed hard, her small throat working. She held up Barnaby a little higher, as if for courage. "Can you help me?" she asked, her voice trembling but clear. "My mommy. She's in a box." A few of the bikers closest to them shifted, a low murmur rippling through the room. "In a box?" one of them muttered. "What's that mean?" Bear held up a hand, and the room fell silent again. He slid off his stool, a slow, deliberate movement. He knelt down onto one knee, a gesture that seemed to take an eternity, the leather of his pants groaning in protest. Kneeling brought his face level with hers, the king of the forge, kneeling to a barefoot child. The entire club watched, mesmerized. Now he could see her more clearly, the dusting of freckles across her nose, the way her eyelashes were clumped together with half-frozen tears, the sheer, unadulterated terror warring with a fierce, burning hope. "A box?" he repeated softly. "What kind of box, Lily?" Lily's eyes widened. "You know my name?" "No," he said gently. "I'm just guessing it suits you. Am I right?" She nodded, a tiny, hesitant motion. "I'm Lily." "Okay, Lily," Bear said, his voice staying low and calm. "I'm Bear. Now you tell me about this box your mommy's in. Is she hurt?" Lily shook her head, her blonde hair, damp with melted snow, sticking to her cheeks. "Not, not a real box. It's, it's made of papers, and angry phone calls, and worry." Her voice cracked. "She won't wake up, sir. She just lies there. And now there's an orange paper on the door. We have to leave tonight. The cold monster will get us." The pieces began to click into place in Bear's mind. Papers, angry calls, eviction. This wasn't a kidnapping. This was something far more common, and in some ways far more cruel. This was the slow, grinding death of poverty. The box was despair. His heart, a thing he thought had been hardened by decades of violence and loss, felt a sharp, painful pang. He looked at this tiny girl, fighting a war against enemies she couldn't even name, using metaphors to describe a horror no child should ever witness. "These papers?" Bear said, his voice tight with a newly forming anger. "Did you bring any of them with you?" Lily nodded. She fumbled inside her thin coat, her fingers stiff and clumsy with cold. She pulled out a crumpled, damp wad of papers, an eviction notice from the Starlight Motel, and tucked inside it several other letters. Final notices from something called Apex Recovery Services. The letterhead a sleek, predatory black and red. The amounts listed were staggering. Medical debt, the kind that crushes families. Bear took the papers from her, his massive, calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. He scanned the top letter. His eyes narrowed. Apex Recovery Services. He'd heard of them. Vultures. Bottom feeders who bought debt for pennies and then harassed people to the brink of insanity to collect. But it was the name on the letters that made the world tilt on its axis. Sarah Croft. The air rushed out of Bear's lungs. He felt like he'd been punched in the gut. Croft. It couldn't be. Not after all these years. His voice was hoarse when he spoke again, barely a whisper. "Lily, what's your mommy's full name?" "Sarah Ann Croft," Lily said, sniffling. "My last name is Croft, too." Bear's gaze shot to the older members of the club, the men who had been with him from the beginning. He saw his own shock and dawning horror reflected in their eyes. Jax, Preacher, Grinder. They were all frozen, their faces pale beneath their beards. "And your father, Lily?" Bear asked, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was almost afraid to hear the answer. "Did you know your father?" Lily shook her head sadly. "No, sir. He died before I was born. Mommy said he was a hero. His name was Michael." Michael. Spike. The name hung in the air of the bar, a ghostly echo from a past they had all tried to bury. Michael Spike Croft. Not just a member, a founder, the heart and soul of the club in the early days. The wild one, the funny one, the one with a smile that could disarm a cop and a loyalty that was absolute. Their brother killed 15 years ago when a drunk driver had crossed the center line on a dark country road. They had mourned him. They had ridden in his honor. They had poured out his favorite whiskey on the spot where he fell. But they had never known. They never knew he was about to be a father. They never knew about Sarah, the girl he'd fallen for so hard, the one he was going to leave the life for. She had disappeared after the funeral, and they, lost in their own grief and rage, had never found her. This barefoot, shivering child was not a stranger. She was Spike's daughter. She was blood. And the box her mother was in, they had helped build it, with their ignorance, with their failure to look for her, to protect the family of their fallen brother. The shame was a physical, bitter taste in Bear's mouth. He looked down at the teddy bear Lily was clutching. He reached out a hesitant finger and gently touched it. It was wearing a tiny hand-stitched leather vest, now faded and worn. On the back was a miniature, crudely drawn wolf's head. "Where did you get this bear, Lily?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "My mommy gave him to me. She said my daddy made the little jacket for me before I was born." Snorts. A single harsh sound broke the silence. It was from Grinder, a man whose face was a roadmap of scars and whose heart was supposedly made of stone. He turned away, scrubbing a hand over his eyes. He and Spike had been prospects together. Bear felt a rage building inside him. It was a cold, pure, righteous fury, different from the hot-headed anger of his youth. This was the anger of a king whose kingdom had failed its most sacred duty. They had let Spike's legacy, his child, suffer in the cold while they sat here, warm and ignorant. He looked back at Lily. Her blue eyes were wide, confused by the sudden, intense emotion swirling around her. She just wanted help for her mother. She had no idea of the ghost she had just resurrected. This changed everything. Everything. Bear reached out and gently placed his huge hand on Lily's small shoulder. The gesture was a promise, a vow. "Lily," he said, his voice no longer just a rumble, but the sound of an avalanche starting high on a mountain. "I'm saying this to you now, and I want you to listen to me very carefully. My name is Bear. These men, we were your father's brotherhood, his family." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "We are going to get your mommy out of the box," he declared, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. "And I promise you, on your father's memory, the people who put her in there are going to wish they had never been born." He looked up, his gaze sweeping over his men. He saw the shame, the grief, and the dawning, terrible resolve in every single face. They understood. The failure was theirs, and so the redemption would be too. "You will never be cold again," he said, his voice softening as he looked back down at the little girl. "You will never be hungry again, and you will never ever be alone again. You are home." A tear, one she hadn't even realized was forming, finally broke free and traced a clean path through the grime on Lily's cheek. She didn't fully understand everything he was saying about brotherhoods and fathers and promises, but she understood the look in his eyes. It was the look of a fortress, of safety. She did the only thing that felt right. She let go of Barnaby with one hand and wrapped her small arm around Bear's massive, leather-clad neck. She buried her face in the rough material of his cut, which smelled of road dust, engine oil, and something else. Something that felt like strength. Bear froze for a second, unused to such open, innocent affection. Then slowly, carefully, as if he were handling the most fragile glass, he wrapped one of his enormous arms around her, pulling her into a gentle, protective embrace. Over her small, shivering back, he met the eyes of his second-in-command, Jax. The message that passed between them needed no words. War had been declared. The embrace lasted only a moment, but it was a turning point, a covenant sealed. When Bear gently pulled back, the entire atmosphere of the forge had transformed. The shock and silence had been replaced by a low, humming energy, the quiet anger of a disturbed hive. "Doc!" Bear called out, his voice now sharp with command. He didn't need to shout. A man detached himself from the crowd. He was leaner than the others, with a neatly trimmed gray beard and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him an unexpectedly scholarly look. He wore the club's cut, but beneath it was a clean, practical work shirt. Before he'd found the Brotherhood, he'd spent 20 years as a paramedic, a life he'd left behind but whose skills he'd never lost. "Right here, Bear," Doc said, his voice calm and professional. He was already kneeling beside Lily, his experienced eyes scanning her. "Her feet," Bear said, his tone clipped. "She's barefoot." Doc nodded, already reaching out. "Lily, can I take a look at your feet? I won't hurt you." His voice was gentle, reassuring. Lily looked to Bear for permission. Bear gave her a small, firm nod. She hesitantly stuck out one of her feet. It was red and blotchy, a frightening shade of pale blue at the tips of her toes. Doc examined it with a light, expert touch. "Superficial frost nip," he diagnosed quietly. "Painful, but no permanent damage if we warm them up slowly. She's lucky. Another hour out there." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. "All right," Bear said, standing to his full, imposing height. The club was his instrument, and he was about to play it. Here's what happens now. Every man in the room gave him their undivided attention. Doc, you're taking point on Sarah. I want you to assemble a team. Preacher, you're with him. He gestured to another man, a quiet, thoughtful biker known for his calming presence. Take my truck. The keys are on the bar. Get to the Starlight Motel. Room 2B, assess Sarah Croft's condition. Be quiet. Be respectful. But get her out of there. Bring her to the safe house. The club maintained a small, unassuming house in a quiet suburb, a place off the books, for situations exactly like this. Jax's wife Maria is there. I'll call ahead. She'll have rooms ready. Get Sarah stable and comfortable. And get this little one's things, everything she owns. His eyes found Lily's. We're not leaving Barnaby's friends behind. Doc and Preacher just nodded. No questions. No hesitation. They moved with a swift, practiced efficiency, gathering a medical kit from a back room and heading for the door. One of the younger prospects, a kid named Rabbit, silently ran to the bar, grabbed a clean, dry bar towel, and gently began to pat Lily's soaked hair. Another biker, a hulking man named Tiny, shrugged off his own massive fleece-lined leather jacket and carefully wrapped it around Lily's small frame. The coat enveloped her like a tent, the sleeves dangling a foot past her hands. The scent of worn leather and wood smoke was overwhelming, but it was warm. So incredibly warm. She burrowed into its depths, a small, safe creature in a giant's cave. Someone else appeared with a steaming mug of hot chocolate, topped with a mountain of whipped cream. Here you go, little miss, the biker grunted, his tattooed knuckles looking out of place, holding the delicate ceramic mug. Lily took it with both hands, the warmth seeping into her frozen fingers. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. Clear's throat. It was a small thing, wasn't it? A warm jacket, a cup of cocoa. But in that moment, it was everything. It was the first act of tangible kindness Lily had felt in so long. It was almost overwhelming. It was the club, in its own gruff, awkward way, saying, "You are one of us now. You are under our protection." While Lily was being swaddled in care, Bear turned his attention to the rest of his men. His face was granite. "Jax!" he barked. His second in command, a man with a sharp, hawkish face and eyes that missed nothing, stepped forward. "Yeah, Bear. Get on the horn. I want the presidents of the North County, Ridgeback, and Iron Valley chapters. Tell them it's a Code Alpha. Tell them it's for Spike." A Code Alpha was the club's highest state of alert, reserved for dire emergencies, a threat to the Brotherhood itself. It hadn't been called in over a decade. To invoke it for Spike, that was a summons no one would ignore. Jax just nodded, pulling out his phone and walking to a quieter corner of the bar. His voice was low but urgent as he began to make the calls. "The rest of you," Bear continued, his voice dropping, but losing none of its authority. "Gear up. I want every bike outside, fueled and ready to roll in 15 minutes. We are going to pay a visit to a company called Apex Recovery Services." He held up the crumpled letters Lily had given him. These people, and whoever they work for, put the widow of a founding member on the street. They tormented his daughter. They drove a good woman into a state of catatonic despair. This is more than a business dispute. This is a blood debt, and tonight we begin to collect. He paused, his eyes scanning the faces of his men, each one a mask of cold, controlled fury. "But let me be crystal clear," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "We are not a mob. We are a brotherhood. We have a code. When we arrive, there will be no violence. There will be no threats. There will be no destruction of property. We will not give them a single thing to use against us. We will simply be present. We will be a wall of silent, immovable consequence. They will break themselves against our discipline. Is that understood?" A low, rumbling chorus of "Yeah, Bear" and "Understood" filled the room. This was the difference between a gang and a club like theirs. This was discipline. This was controlled power. "Good," Bear said with a final, sharp nod. "Go." The room erupted into a whirlwind of controlled, purposeful action. Men moved to the coat racks, pulling on their heavy leather cuts. They drained their glasses, stubbed out their cigarettes. The sound of heavy boots on the wooden floor was like the marching of a small army. Within minutes, the bar was nearly empty. Outside, the night air was shattered by the sound. It started with one engine, a deep, throaty cough that roared to life. Then another, and another, a chorus of controlled thunder, a symphony of internal combustion that vibrated through the ground, shaking the very windows of the surrounding buildings. One by one, headlights cut through the swirling snow, a constellation of bright, angry stars. The mobilization was a sight to behold. It wasn't chaos. It was a drill, practiced and perfect. Bikers from the other chapters began to arrive, drawn by Jax's call. They didn't stop to ask questions. They saw the grim faces of the Forge members, heard the name Spike passed in low, reverent tones, and they fell into formation. A river of headlights snaked down the industrial streets, converging on the Forge. The rumble grew from a murmur to a roar, a sound that made the city itself seem to hold its breath. The police, who knew the club and its leader, kept their distance. They knew Bear's code. They knew this wasn't a riot. This was something else entirely. This was a reckoning. Inside the now quiet bar, Bear knelt beside Lily again. She had finished her cocoa and was wrapped snugly in Tiny's jacket, looking small and overwhelmed, but safe. "Lily," he said softly, "Doc and Preacher are going to get your mom. They're going to take her somewhere warm and safe. Would you like to go with them? Or would you like to stay here with me for a little while longer?" Lily looked at the door, then back at Bear. She was scared for her mom, but she was also scared of being separated from this giant, terrifying man who had suddenly become her anchor in a world that had come unmoored. Can I stay with you?" she whispered. Bear's rugged face softened. "Of course you can, little one. Of course." He scooped her up, jacket and all. It was an effortless motion for him. Lily gasped, suddenly airborne. He settled her on his hip as easily as if she were a bag of groceries. She instinctively wrapped her arms around his neck again. For the first time in months, she felt completely, utterly safe. Bear walked to the door of the Forge. Lily held securely in his arms. He stood in the doorway and looked out at the scene. Over 100 motorcycles idled in the snow-covered street, their engines a low, pulsing growl, their headlights cutting a brilliant swathe through the darkness. The men who rode them sat silent and still, their faces set like stone, waiting for his command. A legion of leather-clad angels of vengeance, summoned by the plea of a single, barefoot child. He looked down at Lily, who was peering out from the collar of the giant jacket, her eyes wide with awe. "Don't you worry," Bear rumbled, his voice a quiet promise against her ear. "The monsters are about to meet the monster hunters." The plan was executed with chilling precision. Doc and Preacher's team arrived at the Starlight Motel minutes after leaving the Forge. They didn't roar up to the curb. They parked Bear's truck quietly down the street and approached on foot, moving like shadows. They were let into room 2B by a nervous, pimply-faced night manager who had been persuaded by a crisp $100 bill and the sheer, unspoken menace of Preacher's silent stare. The room was even worse than Lily's description had implied. It was tiny, claustrophobic, and smelled of damp and despair. The air was frigid, the room's ancient heater having given up the ghost hours ago. And on the bed, under a single threadbare blanket, was Sarah Croft. She was just as Lily had said. Her eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling, but they saw nothing. Her skin was pale and clammy, her breathing shallow. She didn't react when Doc entered the room and knelt beside her. "Sarah?" Doc said softly. "My name is Ben. I'm a friend of Michael's." There was no response. Just that unnerving, vacant stare. Doc quickly and efficiently took her vitals. Her blood pressure was dangerously low, her pulse thready. She was severely dehydrated and malnourished, but more than that, she was suffering from a profound psychological break, a catatonic state brought on by extreme, unrelenting stress. The box was real. Her mind had retreated into it as a last desperate defense against a world that had become too cruel to bear. "She's shutting down," Doc said grimly to Preacher. "We need to get her out of here. Now." They worked with the quiet competence of a trauma team. Preacher gently but firmly began packing the few meager belongings in the room, a handful of clothes, a worn photo album, a child's drawings taped to the wall. into clean bags they had brought. Doc, meanwhile, managed to get Sarah to sip some water with an electrolyte mix, speaking to her in a low, soothing monotone the entire time, telling her she was safe, that help was here, that her daughter was brave and strong and had sent them. Slowly, painstakingly, a flicker of something returned to Sarah's eyes. A tear traced a path from the corner of her eye into her matted hair. It was the first sign of life she had shown in 2 days. With infinite gentleness, they helped her to her feet, wrapped her in a thick, warm blanket, and guided her out of that miserable room, leaving the orange eviction notice mocking an empty doorway. They settled her in the warm truck, and as they pulled away from the Starlight Motel, it was as if they were leaving a tomb behind. Meanwhile, the main force was on the move. Bear had decided against a night assault on the Apex Recovery offices. 100 bikers showing up at a corporate building at midnight would bring the wrong kind of attention. It would look like a threat, like intimidation. His plan was more subtle, more devastating. He wanted to wage psychological war, and for that, he needed the light of day. The club members were dispersed. Some were sent home to get a few hours of sleep. Others were put up in the large bunk room above the forge. Bear himself did not sleep. He sat in his small Spartan office, the door open, watching over Lily, who had finally succumbed to exhaustion and fallen asleep on a worn leather couch, still wrapped in Tiny's jacket. Barnaby the bear held tight against her chest. Bear spent the night on the phone with the club's lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense man named Marcus Thorne, who also happened to be a patch member. He relayed the story, sending pictures of the letters from Apex. Marcus was silent for a long time on the other end of the line. "Bear," he finally said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "This is more than just aggressive collection. The interest rates they're charging, the fees. This is predatory. It's borderline illegal. But the name, Silas Croft. This is what you need to know. Silas Croft is Michael's older brother." Bear felt a jolt of ice in his veins. He had known Spike had a family, and a strange one that had disowned him for joining the club. A wealthy, respectable family. "Go on," Bear said, his voice low. "When their parents died," Marcus explained, "Silas, as the responsible son, inherited everything. The family fortune, the business. He cut Michael off without a penny. There was bad blood there, deep and old. If Silas Croft is behind this debt collection agency, this isn't business, Bear. This is personal. This is a vendetta against a dead man, carried out on his widow and child." The sheer, calculated cruelty of it was breathtaking. To hunt down your own brother's family, to buy their medical debt, and to use it as a weapon to destroy them, it was a level of evil that defied comprehension. "Thank you, Marcus," Bear said, his voice dangerously calm. "I want you at the Apex building tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. sharp. Bring a contract." "What kind of contract?" Marcus asked. "One that transfers a significant, non-revocable trust into Lily Croft's name," Bear said, "and one that signs away every share, every title, every ounce of ownership Silas Croft has in that vulture factory. He's going to liquidate his life's work to pay for his sins." There was a pause. "He'll never agree to that, Bear." "Oh, he'll agree," Bear said softly. "He'll agree." The next morning, the city awoke to an incredible sight. At precisely 8:45 a.m., a river of chrome in the steel flowed through the downtown financial district. Over 100 motorcycles, moving in a tight, disciplined formation, 2 by 2. They obeyed every traffic law. They stopped at every red light. But their presence was an overwhelming force. People on their way to work stopped and stared, their morning coffees forgotten. The rumble of the engines echoed off the glass and steel of the skyscrapers, a primal sound in a civilized world. Their destination was the gleaming 50-story Apex Tower, a monument to corporate avarice. The bikers did not block the entrance. They did not cause a scene. They simply began to park, in every available legal parking spot for 3 blocks. Then one by one they dismounted, their faces grim and unreadable behind their sunglasses. And they began to walk towards the building. They didn't enter as a mob. They entered in small, quiet groups. They filled the massive, marble-floored lobby. They didn't speak. They didn't loiter. Some stood along the walls, their arms crossed. Some sat in the uncomfortable modern chairs. They simply occupied the space. 100 silent, leather-clad giants waiting. The building's security guards, used to dealing with the occasional protester, were utterly paralyzed. They were outnumbered 10 to 1, and these were not college kids with signs. These were men who looked like they had been carved from rock and fury. Yet they were doing nothing wrong. They were just there. Up on the 50th floor, in a corner office with a panoramic view of the city he felt he owned, Mr. Silas Croft was having a very bad morning. His director of security had called him, his voice trembling. "Sir, you need to see this. The lobby, it's full of them. Bikers." Silas Croft, a man in a perfectly tailored $2,000 suit, strode to his window. He looked down. He saw the motorcycles lining the streets, a metallic serpent coiled around his tower. A cold knot of dread began to form in his stomach. He was a man who believed in control, in leverage. This was something he couldn't control. At 9 a.m. sharp, his private assistant, a terrified young woman with a pale face, buzzed his intercom. "Sir, there are 3 men here to see you. They don't have an appointment." "Tell them to make one," Silas snapped. "Sir, I don't think they'll leave. One of them, he's huge." Before Silas could respond, the door to his office opened. Bear entered first. He had to duck his head to get through the frame. He was flanked by Jax and Grinder, 2 men who, on their own, were intimidating enough. Together with Bear, they looked like a delegation from the end of the world. They closed the door behind them, shutting out the terrified gasps of the secretary. Silas Croft, for the first time in his adult life, felt a prickle of genuine fear. He tried to hide it behind a mask of arrogant indignation. "Who do you think you are?" he blustered, straightening his tie. "Barging into my office. I'll have security up here in 30 seconds. Bear didn't answer. He simply walked across the plush, expensive carpet and stood before Silas's massive mahogany desk. The desk was meant to be a barrier, a symbol of power. To Bear, it was just a piece of wood. Slowly, deliberately, Bear reached into his own leather jacket. Silas flinched, a part of his mind screaming, "Gun." But what Bear pulled out was not a weapon. It was a small, worn teddy bear with a tiny leather vest. He placed it gently on the polished surface of the desk, right next to a sterling silver pen set. Barnaby sat there, his button eyes seeming to stare right into Silas Croft's soul. "Michael Croft," Bear said, his voice a quiet, deadly rumble. "You remember that name, don't you, Silas?" Silas Croft's face went white. The carefully constructed facade of the powerful CEO crumbled, revealing the petty, hateful man beneath. He stared at the teddy bear, then at Bear's cold, unyielding eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Oh, I think you do," Bear said, leaning forward slightly, his massive hands resting on the edge of the desk. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. His quiet intensity was more terrifying than any threat. "I think you know all about your little brother, the one you cast out, the one whose memory you decided to desecrate." Jack stepped forward and placed a small digital audio recorder on the desk. "We know everything, Silas. We know you bought the debt. We know you did it out of spite. A pathetic, cowardly little man taking revenge on a dead hero by torturing his family." "This is slander. I'll sue you. I'll sue all of you," Silas shrieked, his voice rising in panic. "Sue the 100 men in your lobby?" Grinder asked with a grim, humorless smile. "Sue the 50 more who are parked outside the homes of your board of directors right now? Just waiting? Sue the local news reporter I just happened to have a chat with on the way in? The one who loves stories about corporate villains and destitute widows?" Silas's eyes darted towards the window, then back to the men in his office. He was trapped. His usual weapons, money, lawyers, influence, were useless against this. This was a different kind of power, an older kind. "What do you want?" he finally whispered, his shoulders slumping in defeat. At that moment, there was a polite knock on the door. Jax opened it. Marcus Thorne, the club's lawyer, walked in carrying a briefcase. He was dressed in a sharp suit, looking every bit the corporate attorney, except for the subtle bulge of the leather cut he wore beneath his suit jacket. "Mr. Croft," Marcus said, his tone all business, My name is Marcus Thorne. I represent the estate of Michael Croft and his sole heir, Lily Croft. He opened his briefcase on the corner of the desk and laid out a sheaf of documents. This, he said, tapping the first document, is a legally binding agreement canceling all outstanding debt attributed to Sarah Croft. You will sign it. This, he said, tapping the second, is the paperwork for a trust fund in the name of Lily Croft. You will fund it with a transfer of $20 million. Consider it back pay for the inheritance you stole from your brother. Silas choked. 20 million? That's insane. That's everything. Not everything, Marcus said coolly, but it's a good start. And this, he said, producing the final document, is the dissolution of Apex Recovery Services. You will sign over all assets to a charity for victims of predatory debt, a charity of our choosing. You will walk away with nothing. Your name will be mud, but you will walk away, which is more than you deserve. Silas stared at the papers, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. His entire empire, his life's work, about to be signed away on his own desk. You can't do this, he whimpered. It's extortion. Bear leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a near inaudible whisper that was more chilling than a scream. Extortion, he breathed. Extortion is calling a grieving widow 50 times a day. Extortion is sending letters threatening to take a sick woman's child. Extortion is driving a mother to the brink of suicide while her daughter watches, all for a few $1,000s and a petty, pathetic grudge. He stood up straight. This is not extortion, Silas. This is justice. It's a concept you might not be familiar with. You built your house on the pain of others. We're just here to collect the rent. He gestured to the papers. Sign them. Sign them, and you get to disappear. You get to live out your miserable life in obscurity. Refuse, and I walk out of this office. And I can't be responsible for what 100 grieving, angry men might do when they find out the man who tormented their brother's child is refusing to make things right. I can't promise that their discipline will hold. I can't promise your slander story won't be on the 6 o'clock news tonight, complete with a tearful interview with a 10-year-old girl. He let the threat hang in the air, unspoken but perfectly clear. Silas Croft looked at the papers. He looked at the impassive, stony faces of the bikers. He looked at the teddy bear, a silent, plush judge on his desk. He saw his life, his reputation, his fortune, all turning to dust. He was a coward. He had always been a coward. His cruelty was the bluster of a weak man. And now, faced with real strength, he crumbled completely. With a trembling hand, he picked up his sterling silver pen, and he began to sign. With every stroke of the pen, a wall of the invisible box around Sarah Croft came tumbling down. The ride back from the city was different. The engine still rumbled, but it was a softer sound now, a sound of satisfaction, of a job well done. Justice had been served, not by a court of law, but by a code of honor. Bear had called ahead. It's done, was all he said. They didn't go back to the forge. They went to the safe house. It was a simple, two-story home on a quiet, tree-lined street, indistinguishable from any other house in the neighborhood. But inside it was a sanctuary. Maria, Jax's wife, a warm, formidable woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, met them at the door. She had been a flurry of activity all morning. The house was clean, warm, and filled with the smell of freshly baked bread. Lily, who had ridden in the cab of Bear's truck, nestled safely between him and Grinder, was taken inside. In the living room, a fire crackled in the hearth, and sitting on the couch, wrapped in a warm quilt, was her mother. Sarah was awake, truly awake. The vacant, haunted look was gone, replaced by a fragile, weary lucidity. Her hair had been washed and brushed. She was sipping a cup of hot tea. When she saw Lily, her face crumpled, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she spoke her daughter's name. Lily! Mommy! Lily flew across the room and into her mother's arms. They clung to each other, two survivors of a terrible storm, finally washed ashore on a safe island. The tears came then, not tears of despair, but of overwhelming, cathartic relief. You're out, Lily sobbed into her mother's shoulder. You're out of the box. Sarah held her daughter tight, rocking her back and forth, tears streaming down her own face. She looked up from her daughter's hair and saw the men standing in the doorway. Bear, Jax, Grinder, hulking, intimidating figures, filling the frame, their faces unexpectedly gentle. Her gaze settled on Bear. She didn't know who he was, not really. She only knew that this giant of a man and his army of giants had somehow saved them. "Why?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse and emotion. "Who are you? Why would you do all this for us?" Bear walked slowly into the room and knelt down, just as he had done for Lily in the bar. He was a mountain humbling himself. "Sarah," he said, his voice a low, respectful rumble. "My name is Bear. We knew Michael. He was our brother." Sarah's eyes widened in recognition. Michael had talked about them, his brothers, his club. She had been wary of them, of the life he led. It was part of why she had run, why she had hidden after his death. She had been afraid. "We failed him," Bear continued, his voice thick with a shame that was 15 years old. "When he died, we lost track of you. We didn't know about Lily. We didn't know you were struggling. That is a failure our club will carry forever. It is a stain on our honor." He looked from Sarah to Lily, who was now peering at him from the safety of her mother's embrace. "But your daughter," he said, a hint of awe in his voice. "Your daughter is braver than any man in my club. She walked into hell to save you. She reminded us of who we are supposed to be. She reminded us what our brotherhood is for." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document. It was a copy of the trust agreement. "Your financial problems are over," he said simply. "Forever. The man responsible for your pain will never trouble you or anyone else again." Sarah stared at him, at the paper, her mind struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what had happened in the last 24 hours. From the brink of homelessness and despair to this, to safety, to salvation. "Family," Bear said, his gaze sweeping over the other members in the room, "is not just about blood, Sarah. It's about loyalty. It's about showing up. Spike was our family. That makes you and Lily our family too. We don't leave family behind. Not ever again." Then Jack stepped forward. He was holding something in his hands. It was a small, brand new leather vest, a perfect miniature of the ones they all wore. It had no club patches, no insignia of rank, but stitched carefully over the heart in bright pink thread was a single word: Lily. And below it, a beautifully embroidered patch of a roaring mother bear, standing protectively over a small cub. "Every hero deserves a uniform," Jack said with a rare small smile. He held it out to Lily. Lily looked at her mom, who nodded, her eyes shining with tears. Lily shyly took the vest. It was made of soft, supple leather and smelled new and wonderful. She slipped it on over her sweater. It fit perfectly. She looked down at the vest, then up at the huge, bearded, tattooed men surrounding her. They weren't monsters. They weren't scary. They were her knights, her father's brotherhood, her family. The club had also secured a new apartment for them, a bright, sunny two-bedroom place just a few blocks away in a good school district. They had paid the first year's rent. The pantry, they would later find, was fully stocked. A network of wives and sisters of the club had furnished it, right down to the fresh linens on the beds and a brand new set of crayons for Lily. This wasn't just a rescue. This was an adoption. The entire club, 100 strong, had just adopted a widow and her child. They were now under the protection of the roaring wolf. And God help anyone who ever tried to hurt them again. Clears throat. And now a year has passed. The snow is falling again, but this time, it's not a monster. It's beautiful. It dusts the trees in the park with a soft white blanket. Lily, now 11, is laughing, her cheeks rosy from the cold. She's wearing proper snow boots, a warm winter coat, and under it, her small leather vest. She's in a sledding race with 2 other kids, their shouts of joy echoing in the crisp air. Her mother, Sarah, watches from a nearby bench. The haunted look is a distant memory. She is healthy, vibrant, her eyes clear and full of life. She has a job she loves at a local library, a job the club helped her find. She sips from a thermos of hot coffee, a peaceful smile on her face. She's not watching alone. Parked along the curb are 3 motorcycles. Bear, Jax, and Grinder sit on their bikes, engines off, just watching. They're a familiar sight here now. The silent guardians. The other parents in the park, once intimidated, now just nod and smile. They know who they are. They're Lily's uncles. Lily's sled wins the race. She tumbles out into a soft snowbank, laughing. She brushes herself off, then turns and runs, not to her mother, but straight toward the bikers. She doesn't slow down. She launches herself into Bear's arms, and he catches her in a massive hug, lifting her off the ground. "I won, Uncle Bear," she yells. "I never had a doubt, little one," he rumbles, his voice full of a gruff affection that is now second nature to him. Never had a doubt. This story isn't really about motorcycles or tattoos. It's not about vengeance or intimidation. It's about what it means to show up. It's about the family you choose, and the family that, if you're very, very lucky, chooses you back. It's about a promise made to a fallen brother, finally kept. We're so often taught to judge a book by its cover, to fear the leather, the noise, the nonconformity. We build boxes for people in our minds, labeling them dangerous or outcast without ever reading a single page of their story. But this story reminds us that heroes don't always wear capes or shiny armor. Sometimes they wear leather and ride on thrones of chrome and steel. Sometimes the most fearsome-looking people hide the most heroic hearts. So I want you to look around your own life. Who needs a protector? Who is lost in a box of their own, waiting for someone to show them a way out? You don't need a motorcycle club to be a hero. You just need a heart that is willing to see past the surface and a courage that is willing to act. If this story moved you, if you believe in the power of chosen family and unexpected heroes, then tap that subscribe button and become part of our family right here. We believe in these stories, and we believe in the community that gathers around them. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. And more than that, tell us who was the biker in your life? Who was the unexpected protector who showed up when you needed them most? Ride with us, stand with us, and never ever forget to look for the heroes in disguise. They are all around you.